Hello and welcome to the programme. Let's go straight to that major breaking news. Turkey's president has said the military operation against Kurdish fighters in northeastern Syria has begun. President Erdogan insisted the aim was to destroy what he called a terror corridor on Turkey's southern border. There are multiple reports of explosions inside Syria. The withdrawal of US troops from the region at the start of the week paved the way for the operations. That decision by Donald Trump was savage domestically and internationally. Let me just show you some of the latest pictures. These Turkish aircraft took off as part of these operations. In the last hour, the Kurdish-led SDF asked the US to impose a no-fly zone to stop Turkish attacks. Well, these pictures have just come into the building showing the aftermath of blasts which hit the Syrian border town of Tel Abyad, a town which is home to Kurdish military bases and ammunition stores. From those pictures, let me take you to the live pictures right on the border. You can see those plumes of smoke. It's a couple of hours now since that very simple sentence that was initially released from President Erdogan saying the operation had started. Well, watching all of this with me is the BBC's Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen. Jeremy, confirmation of what we knew was coming.
Yeah, they've been quite open about it. It hasn't been a big secret at all. They've said that this is something that they had to do. And all this came from a few days ago, you'll remember, when Donald Trump put out a tweet essentially saying the US no longer had any objection to all of this, that some of their troops would be pulled out. And it was, essentially a green light for the Turks and for President Erdogan to send in his troops.
And he has, and it is a major offensive. We've seen the hardware, the pictures of the aircraft, we've seen the military hardware on the ground. We saw the build-up for a couple of days. What we don't know at this stage, Jeremy, do we, is whether the Kurdish fighters will stay and fight.
No, we don't know that, but the thing to remember about them is that while they fought very effectively on the ground against the jihadists of Islamic State, it's a different thing now. They'd be coming up, if they wanted to fight the Turks, they'd be fighting a big NATO army, the second biggest force in NATO. So I don't think that any military guy on their side is going to suggest that they try and take them on. They may in some places, who knows. There may be behind the scenes talks going on via a third party about, you might go there, but we might be here, that sort of thing. Maybe the Turks want to calm things down while they keep up this high level of rhetoric. The fact is, though, what underlies this from the Turkish point of view is that they really, really believe that these Kurds on that side of the border who've been allied with the United States are terrorists, that they are very connected with the Kurdish separatists in the PKK in Turkey, who've been active for many, many years, and that is why they want to go after them.
And that's the extraordinary nature of the turnaround from US policy. As you exactly say, they've been fighting alongside the Americans for years now against Islamic State, and now the Turks going after them as terrorists. Do we know at this stage just how far President Erdogan wants to go into Syria?
No, we don't. There have been various bits of speculation about it. The Turks are already in northwestern Syria, so this is northeastern Syria, and they seem to want to establish what in South Lebanon the Israelis used to call the security zone, a strip of land that they feel would deal with, as he called it, Erdogan called it, this so-called corridor of terror. But it's not clear exactly what they want, what their objectives are in terms of territory, but I think they do want to change the game in that part of Syria, and that for Erdogan is very important.
The worrying thing, and we saw this, we talked right at the start of the week after this decision from Donald Trump, the worrying thing for all of those international observers, the people who've criticised the president's move, is unforeseen consequences of what we're now seeing being played out here on the ground.
When militaries go to war, there are always unforeseen consequences. That is absolutely going to happen. So it could be that the Turks are going to be quite cautious. I think that they might be wanting to play a clever political game at the same time in terms of the reactions of the US and their other NATO allies. You know, we'll see how far they push. It's interesting, they've started these big fires near the border. that the cameras of the media can see very, very easily. What might they be doing further in? Well, we don't really know.
Well, you talk about the border, and these are the live pictures coming in from just one of the positions. And here at the BBC, we have just a number of different feeds from the different agencies, as well as our teams on the ground. So we'll bring you constantly the updated pictures and developments as they happen. In terms of developments, just in the last few minutes as I was heading down to the studio, the French, the British looking to try to get the UN Security Council to meet in emergency session. Diplomatically, there'll be moves to try to pull this back.
Yep, there will be. In this kind of event, there is always, very, very often anyway, a special session of the UN Security Council. That is exactly what it's for, to try to regulate these kinds of things, to try and calm it down, to push for some kind of a ceasefire. But I think at the moment, while it's still very, very early days, and it's not clear exactly where the Turks are going to go. Will they take that whole strip along the frontier, or will it be more limited than that? I think that, this is going to be developing.
One of the areas of concern is, of course, IS fighters captured by the Kurdish forces over the last couple of years. Thousands. I think there are 4,000 foreign nationals, as well as all of the others. The concern is quite what happens to them as a result of all of this.
Yeah, because most of them are in prisons guarded by the Kurds. There are others who are guarded by the Americans, but essentially the Kurds are in charge of those prisons, and they are further back from the area where they've pushed in at the moment. But yes, this is one of the major worries about all of this, that IS fighters might break out, they might have a resurgence. There's an IS resurgence already going on in Syria and Iraq in terms of guerrilla activity, in terms of bombings. And this is the kind of thing that might give it the kind of push that they dream of.
Jeremy, stay with me, because this is moving very, very fast there on the ground. So stay with me. I mentioned a moment or two ago our teams on the ground. Well, our correspondent, Orla Guerin, is there on the border. She's on the Turkish side of the border. Just a short while ago, she gave us this update.
So we have been seeing and hearing the opening salvos of this Turkish offensive on northeastern Syria. If you're hearing noise in the background now, it's police vehicles that are going around announcing to civilians to leave the area. We have heard outgoing artillery fire and mortar rounds. There has been incoming mortar fire also from just across the border in northeastern Syria, but it didn't reach as far as Turkish territory. Now, President Erdogan has said this is the beginning of Operation Peace Spring, as he calls it. But I think there's no doubt that for the Syrian civilians who are just across the border within sight of us here, this is going to feel like another round of battle in an agonizingly long war. The Turks' stated objectives here are twofold. First of all, they say they want to create what they call a safe zone, or essentially a buffer, a security buffer along their border. And they say they want to allow for the return of about 2 million Syrian refugees. Now, Turkey has been hosting 3.6 million Syrians. It's a considerable burden on the economy. It's a political issue for President Erdogan, and he is anxious to see those refugees go back. But the Syrian Kurdish forces say that actually what's at stake here is demographic engineering, that the Turks wish to send Syrian Arab refugees across the border into this part of northeastern Syria, which they regard very much as Kurdish territory. So they claim this is really an attempt to dilute their influence and their control. And of course, they also have been emphasizing almost frantically in the last few days that the gains that have been made and were so hard fought and hard won in their long battle against Islamic State are now being put at risk. I mean, the Syrian Democratic Forces have lost an estimated 11,000 fighters in battling IS. They succeeded, with American help, to push IS out of a large swathe of territory. But they say that those gains are at risk. They point out that, for example, they may have to withdraw some of their forces from the prisons where they are guarding about 10,000 IS fighters. They say they may have to withdraw men from territory that has been recently liberated from IS. And they point out that just last night there was an attack in Raqqa. Now, you'll remember that was the former capital of the IS Caliphate. And last night, 3 IS suicide bombers struck Kurdish positions in the city. So the Kurds are basically saying to the international community, the war that we fought on your behalf is now being put at risk. All of those gains are now at risk because of what Turkey is trying to do.
Well, that's Orla Guerin there on the border. We'll be live in Washington in just a moment or two, but let's come back to Jeremy Bowen, our Middle East editor. And Jeremy, we talked about the fluid nature of this, the fast-moving pace of this. Just some of the latest reports giving us a little clue of quite how far into Syria the Turks have gone.
Yeah, there's one in the last few minutes via the Reuters news agency quoting the Syrian Kurdish group, the SDF, saying Turkish warplanes struck positions 50 kilometers deep inside Syria in a place called Aynisa. Now, it's not surprising they're trying to do that kinds of thing. I'm sure what they have got, what the Turks have got, would be a list of targets, places where the Kurds might be known to keep weaponry, strong points, and those things they might well try to hit. What they don't want to get involved with, I think, with the Kurds is any kind of street fighting, if they went into a town, or any kind of ground fighting.
All right, Jeremy, you're going to be with us throughout the course of the programme. Thank you very much for now. As promised, let's head to Washington. Gary O'Donoghue is there for us. Gary, give us the latest from there, because only an hour or so ago, that same group Jeremy was talking about just now, pleading with the Americans to have some sort of no-fly zone to stop the aerial attacks.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, just picking up on, as you say, on what Jeremy was saying there, we're hearing that the Americans have made it pretty clear that they're not going to conduct any air operations in terms of intercepting the Turkish forces and the Turkish aircraft, that they will conduct operations to protect their own troops on the ground if needed, but it seems that the Turks have been given some kind of green light that they have freedom of movement in the air, which is obviously very significant in terms of their effectiveness for what they're trying to do. We've heard nothing from the White House or the Pentagon or the State Department after the news broke that the move was on. One of the president's staunchest allies, Senator Lindsey Graham, you remember he was very critical over the weekend of the president's actions in pulling those troops back from the border. He's been on social media again saying this is a disaster. And let me just read you one tweet for him which indicates how much the president is at odds with some of his staunchest allies. He says, "Pray for our Kurdish allies who've been shamelessly abandoned by the Trump administration. This move ensures the re-emergence of ISIS." And the reason Matthew is mentioning ISIS there is because there are, of course, a whole bunch of prison camps in this area with tens of thousands, well, upwards of 10,000 former ISIS fighters in them. And of course, they're guarded by members of the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, largely Syrian Kurds. And if they're going to be diverted away to taking on Turkish forces, then the risk, of course, is that you will have a whole bunch of former IS fighters on the loose again.
Yes, one of the unforeseen circumstances and consequences that people are so worried about. In terms of the diplomacy, I was talking to Jeremy about those French and British moves to try to get a UN Security Council meeting urgently on all of this. I mean, in the last 48 hours there in Washington, Gary, after the initial announcement from the president, there was so much criticism. There was a sort of vain hope that perhaps the president might change his mind. It seems like we've passed that moment now.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, before we got the announcement from Ankara this morning about this operation, the president was on Twitter. He hasn't said anything since then about it, but he was on Twitter doubling down on the whole argument about bringing troops home, about the amount of money that the Americans had spent, the trillions of dollars, as he put it, the Americans have spent in the Middle East, about the need for Turkey to take care of these or to look out for these IS fighters, because, you know, as he had a swipe at the Europeans on that one as well for not taking back returned IS fighters, former European fighters. So there doesn't seem to be any effect on the press. But having said all that, he did say also, he did threaten Turkey. He did say he would obliterate the country's economy if Turkey made a move. So there were some threats against Turkey, but nothing has emerged. I can also tell you that we are hearing from some lawmakers on Capitol Hill who are preparing some kind of cross-party legislation in terms of sanctions against Turkey. I think that's likely to go through pretty easily because there's a lot of concern on both sides of the aisle about Turkish actions. And you mentioned the United Nations move as well. We'll see what happens there later on today. But the president is, at the moment, not getting a lot of public support for what he's done, really, from anyone here in terms of the political class.
All right, Gary O'Donoghue, live for us there in Washington. Thanks from the latest where you are. Just a quick pointer, because the military action is expected to compound the already massive humanitarian crisis on the Syrian border. Here in the next few minutes, we'll talk to Save the Children's Syria director on that aspect of what is happening. We'll also bring you the latest pictures, the latest detail. As I say, this story is moving very, very rapidly, so do stay with us throughout the course of this programme. We will constantly return to this major story there in Syria. Let's return to that, very much our developing and breaking story, because let me take you first back to the live pictures from the border area, because a little darker just since we were last there, but right around the border we've seen the movement of military hardware. We have seen the plumes of smoke as the artillery has started. We're probably about 3 hours into the operation since that announcement from Turkey's president that the operation had started. And watching all of the developments with me is our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams. Paul, you were listening there to what Jeff Flake was saying. You were seeing also the tweet from Lindsey Graham, a huge amount of criticism about the president's change of policy. And the dominoes have fallen very, very quickly since the start of the week.
Yeah, I mean, we heard already from Lindsey Graham and others right at the beginning of the week expressions of horror at what they thought might be about to unfold. And in the 3 hours since the operation began, we are seeing quite a considerable amount of reaction. We've had the German and French foreign ministers saying they strongly condemn the Turkish offensive and calling on President Erdogan to, in the words of the German foreign minister, pursue security interests peacefully. I hear that Britain, France and Germany are all working on a joint statement at the moment. You've heard also about the possibility that we might see developments at the UN Security Council. The NATO Secretary General, of course, Turkey, long-standing member of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, saying that NATO has been informed by the Turkish authorities. I count on Turkey, he says, to act with restraint. He also says that he plans to discuss this with President Erdogan on Friday. And meanwhile, as we've just seen on those pictures, this is unfolding. President Erdogan has waited a long time to launch this operation. I very much doubt that he's in a mind to listen to those telling him to stop now.
Yes, this is not something that has suddenly been moved in the last few weeks or months. He has wanted to do this for years. Before I ask you the next question, I just want to put onto the screen a few more of the latest pictures that are coming in of a mortar attack on one of those border areas, and you can see, and this has been going on since this operation started. What are you hearing? We saw one report of from the SDF of positions being struck 50 kilometres inside of Syria. It is just one report that the SDF talked to the Reuters news agency. Just how far into Syria do we think Turkey is going to go?
Well, that was quite a telling report, because that was Ain Issa, which is on the M4 motorway, which cuts across northern Syria about 30 kilometres. It varies quite a bit from the border. It is crucially, it is one of the two areas where we saw American forces withdrawing from their observation posts on Monday. So it was clear to the Americans at Ain Issa on Monday that that was likely to be one of the first targets. And it suggests that, and there has been some speculation, that that M4 motorway will mark the edge of this so-called safety zone or security buffer that the Turks want to create. What we don't know is the extent of President Erdogan's ambitions. Will he be content with something just along the border, or does he intend to go further in? And the other thing that's worth remembering is this is the third Turkish incursion into northern Syria. All of them have had essentially the same objective, which is to push back the Kurdish fighters of the YPG away from the border, because in President Erdogan's view, the YPG and the Turkish PKK are one and the same.
We've talked about the military aspect of this. We've talked about the diplomatic aspect of this. Let's talk a little bit about the human aspect of it. In a moment or two, we'll talk to Save the Children that works in these camps in this region. But I want to put on the screen some more new pictures that have just come into us, just of people in one of the border towns, just trying to get away from the incursion, the military action they've seen. You can see just there on the road the amount of vehicles that are just trying to get away as far as they can from what is playing out. Now, the interesting thing, Paul, from Turkey's president is one of the reasons he puts forward for creating what he describes as a safe zone is to move all of those refugees in Turkey back into Syria. There is an important caveat to that, which is that most of those refugees do not come from this particular area. They come from somewhere completely different.
Yeah. So, look, President Erdogan has 4 million Syrian refugees, and he's been hosting them for years now. He's desperate to send them home. And this again has been part of his objective for some time. If you think back to about a year and a half ago, Operation Olive Branch, which was in the Afrin region, further to the west, but again along the border, that led, by the UN's estimate, to about 137,000 people fleeing their homes, and some Syrian refugees being rehoused in those areas. And, by the way, as many as 300 or so civilians killed in that operation, despite President Erdogan saying that he hadn't caused a single nosebleed among the civilian population. I think people will be thinking about the Afrin operation as they watch the early stages of this latest operation, because this is much bigger. It's on a much bigger scale. The potential for humanitarian hardship is much greater. If President Erdogan is determined to settle as many as 2 million Syrian refugees from other parts of Syria in that area, then this is a kind of social engineering that we have not yet seen from him, except on a small scale in Afrin. And this obviously creates the possibility for whole new areas of tension in that part of the world.
Just a final thought for now. When we were talking to Jeremy Bowen a short while ago, he made the point, just the size of this army, the Turkish army that is being used in this offensive against the Kurdish fighters, because I was asking about whether the Kurdish fighters would stay and fight or simply flee. I mean, a lot of people worried about the long-term consequences of this in terms of the destabilising aspect, because they may stay and fight, but they may also retreat and then have a very elongated sort of conflict with that Turkish presence.
I suspect that that is what is likely to happen. There's been some talk in the last week or so of them pulling back from some of their strategic positions. It's worth noting, by the way, it's not just the Turkish army that's about to invade, we believe, but it's also other pro-Turkish Syrian fighters who've been brought in from Afrin, the so-called Free Syrian Army, who we used to think of as, if you like, representing the opposition to President Assad. Many of those units have been brought through Turkey in the last few days. They are now poised to enter through the border fences into this new offensive. So we're going to have a very toxic mix of the Kurdish fighters and their Syrian allies, and the Turkish army and their Syrian allies. As always with this Syrian conflict, it's going to be enormously complicated.
All right, Paul Adams, thanks very much for now. We were talking only a moment ago with Paul about the human consequences. Let's talk more about that particular aspect of what we are seeing happening in northeastern Syria. Sonia Kush is the Director of Syria Operations for Save the Children, an independent charity working inside refugee camps along the Syrian border. Thank you for being with us on the programme. How worrying, how alarmed are you by this military action that we're seeing?
Well, obviously, it's very concerning for us, mainly because we know about the potential impact on the humanitarian situation in northeast Syria. Northeast Syria already has more than 1.6 million people who are in need of assistance. So any sort of military incursion that causes additional displacement is going to have devastating consequences on civilians. And we really urge all military parties involved in this to make sure that the impact on civilians is taken into account and any negative effects avoided.
Just give me an idea, and people watching this around the world, give me an idea geographically how close this incursion will be to some of those camps that Save the Children are involved with.
Well, the attacks today happened near Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain and towards Ain Issa. So there is a camp in Ain Issa that hosts evacuees from Raqqa, including foreign women and children that were formerly associated with ISIS. So it actually is quite close to the camps. When we're talking about Al-Hol, that's a bit farther away. But in such a fluid situation, we just don't know how far this is going to go. And so we're very concerned about, as you mentioned, the camps. Those people are completely reliant on humanitarian assistance, and we can't afford any break in the services to them.
You mentioned IS fighters and IS or families of IS fighters. Is it clear to you what is likely to happen? What do you think should happen to those groups of people?
Our urgent request to the 40 different countries who have children living in those camps in very difficult conditions is to repatriate them. Children should not be growing up in a camp with poor services, with no freedom of movement. They're living under horrific conditions, having survived very traumatic lives under ISIS control, and we really need to get them home. So our call is to governments who can take them out now, because we know how to get them out, is to urgently repatriate them and give them a chance at a normal childhood.
Well, we know what various governments have said about that, and it's exactly the opposite at the moment. So those people are there in the camps, and we will see with this incursion, because the Americans have talked about it now being Turkey's responsibility to hold these captured fighters and their family. In terms of all of the other refugees, the Turkish plan is to move. You might have heard me asking Paul Adams to move most of the refugees in Turkey back into Syria. How practical is that?
I don't think it's very practical. When you look at the population that's in Turkey, it's been said that approximately 17% actually have come from northeast Syria. So you're talking about moving people back who are not from there. And the basic concept is that we're very much against forced returns in general. Returns need to be voluntary, they need to be safe, they need to be dignified. So any kind of forced return to Syria is really not acceptable to us.
Just a final quick thought. Will what we're seeing, this military operation, how much will that actually hamper physically what you are doing there on the ground?
It really depends on how far the operation goes and what Turkey does in terms of occupying land. If it's a short-term incursion, only a few kilometers into Syria, and then the troops pull out, it probably won't affect it very much. But we just don't know, and so we're very worried about any longer-term implications. We could start to see displacements. In fact, we are already seeing the displacements out of Tel Aviv and Ras Al Ain, but that could increase. So you could see displacements all over northeast Syria, and it's going to be a challenge for organizations like Save the Children to provide assistance to those families in the middle of military operations.
Well, Sonia Kush, thank you for taking time to speak to us, to tell us more about the humanitarian side of what we're seeing going on there in northeastern Syria. Now, we're going to take just the shortest of breaks. When we come back, we'll have plenty more. We'll return to that developing breaking story. Some of the live pictures from the Turkey-Syrian border. We know that the UK and France trying to get an emergency session at the UN. We'll talk to a former Foreign Office diplomat here, minister, with here on our global programme, and that's coming up in a moment or two. Welcome back to the programme, and let's go straight back to that breaking news. Turkey's president saying the military operation against Kurdish fighters in northeast Syria has begun. These some of the pictures since that operation started. We saw those Turkish jets take off to start the aerial campaign on the ground. There's been artillery fire. We have seen for the last 2 days the build-up of Turkish military hardware. That now has been deployed. It is operational as they move inside the northeast of Syria to take on Kurdish fighters. This just some of the border areas that have been shelled in the last little while, and we've seen pictures also in the last couple of hours of people just trying to move away from these areas that now are very close to that military action. There you see just a line of cars on the border area as people try to actually flee what is happening on the ground. Let's speak to the UK's former Minister of State for the Middle East, Alistair Burt. Alistair Burt, thank you for being here on the programme. Your reaction to what we are seeing over the last couple of hours?
Well, it's a deeply worrying situation. I think everyone was very afraid that if Turkey launched such an action as this, particularly as nobody quite knows the boundaries of that action, it would produce in the first place a very rapid deterioration in the humanitarian situation. And that we're seeing as the pictures are that people are fleeing because they don't know what else to do. They're trying to get away from the action. And that will be compounded by other movements of people. And of course, it depends how long the incursion is likely to take. But because there is no there are no parameters to this, and there's no consultation with any others, I think it's an extremely worrying and dangerous situation.
Let's take it in stages, because there are so many different strands of this that are worth hearing your thoughts on. You talked about the dangers there. Just tell me in more detail what you see as the headline risks, dangers on the ground as a consequence of this.
Well, there are a number. Firstly, you have those in the areas where there will be immediate fighting. If there is bombing taking place, it's arguable that it will all be directed at military targets, and that there won't be some targets that will be mistakenly seen as military, and that will involve civilians. People will clearly move away from the action wherever they can, and they will move to whatever areas of safety they can. So you will start to get an immediate problem of people looking for safety, for shelter, for food. Then you have the camps that are already well distributed around the area. If we're talking about Turkey seeking a what it calls a safe zone of 20 miles deep and 300 miles long, throughout that area, there are a whole series of camps, as well as the areas in which people are already living. This is an area where many hundreds of thousands of people are living. It's a fairly fertile plain. It's not a desert area. They will be concerned about what's happening. Then, in addition to that, you have those who are already, as I said, in camps, including those who are already in internment camps as former fighters. So you have a mass displacement of very different sorts of people, possibly very quickly.
Now, we know that diplomatic moves are already underway at the UN. Jean-Claude Juncker has also spoken, urged for restraint, urged Turkey to change policy. You know that President Erdogan has wanted to do this for years. Realistically, is there any way back from this, whatever we see at the UN, whatever we see from various capitals?
I think the first thing is to try and find out exactly how extensive this will be. I think the world has always recognized that a state has the right to defend itself from terror. And President Erdogan has always said that some of those who were in the Syrian side of the border as Kurdish forces were those who were allied to those committing terror in Turkey. And people understand that. But the difficulty has been that he has not distinguished between different groups in the same way the rest of the world has distinguished. And some of those that fear attacked are those Kurdish forces that fought against ISIS, freed Kobani and Manbij, and took part in actions which saved all the rest of us.
Yeah.
And there's severe concern about how far this will go. So I think what has to be done is to try and find out. Firstly, the Security Council has got to meet quickly. It's got to ascertain from Turkey what it intends to do, because if it's limited, that's one thing. But if it's extensive as feared, then the world is going to face a much bigger problem.
Is this the new world order, though, that President Trump can make a decision like this, an about turn, without even consulting his allies like the UK or people closer who have been there on the ground on this as well? And in terms of the implications for IS fighters who've already been captured, and Washington now saying that's the responsibility now of Turkey, how concerned are you about both those areas?
Well, being blunt, if you're saying, is this the new world order in terms of decisions being taken, it looks as though it is. And this is very frightening. The world built up a multilateral system of international world order to try and make sure that unilateral actions did not take place. We've seen that break down. The Security Council has not been able to prevent conflict in recent years. And this is what has produced the situation in Syria. And what it means is that strong individuals are prepared to act on their own unilaterally. This is highly dangerous, and we need to return to a situation in which decisions are taken in concert, recognizing the pressures that are on particular states, including that from terrorism, but trying to ensure that action is not taken unilaterally which can produce the situation which we're seeing today. So yes, I think I am extremely concerned about where this is going. The world order has to re-establish itself soon, because at the moment, as we see in Syria, the only people who are making decisions are those with guns and those with boots on the ground. Everyone else, for all the talk, are essentially irrelevant.
Alistair Burt, we have to leave it there, but we're grateful for you joining us and that analysis here on our programme today. Thanks so much for your time. Just a development in terms of what is happening diplomatically. We're now hearing that the UN Security Council will discuss Syria later on Thursday at requests from various European members. We talked about Britain, we talked about France after the launch of that operation. So the UN Security Council will discuss Syria, but that is on Thursday. Also being reported, let me tell you, we've seen some of the pictures, the artillery fire, the various bits of the operation that's been underway now for about 3 or 4 hours. Kurdish forces saying that 2 people have already been killed and warning of a humanitarian crisis. So that just a couple of the latest lines. Let's speak to our correspondent Ija Gugsedev, who joins me here, and let us just slightly rewind, because this operation started with a one sentence from Turkey's president saying the operation has begun. Tell me a little more about what he said in terms of the objectives.
So Turkish public also was aware of the operation which started today by President Erdogan's tweet, and he said that the operation aims to fight against 2 terror groups, in his words, YPG and ISIS, in North Syria, and he described the mission as preventing terror corridor on its southern border. And he also talked about the establishing a safe zone and return of Syrian refugees to this safe zone. If I should give you the details, this safe zone has been wanted by Turkey since the beginning of Syrian war, but lately, after 2014, when the YPG started to control all these border areas with Turkey, Erdogan and Erdogan's government, Ankara, has been asking to European countries and also the US to create a safe zone on this border. And also Turkey has been hosting more than 3.6 million Syrian refugees in Turkey for years, and Erdogan wants to send these refugees back to Syria, and he wants to create this safe zone in order to send these refugees back.
Give me an idea of the scale of the operation, just how much Turkish military hardware is being used, and give me also a sense, and viewers watching around the world who may not be familiar with the situation on the ground, when we talk about Kurdish fighters in these groups, what are the sort of numbers we're talking about?
So what we know is there are more than 20,000 fighters in the SDF in Syria, but we don't know exactly how many of them are in the border areas that Turkish operation started. And if you talk about the range of the operation, we know that the US soldiers withdrew from only a specific area of the border, which includes only 100 kilometers of the border, and Turkey started the operation from these areas, which is Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain. And we also know that Turkey is the second biggest army of the NATO, so it has the power to go
Let me interrupt you. I said earlier that this story is really moving at a pace, and we've seen that already in the first hour of the programme. The latest line coming in from the SDF is that they are now officially stopping their anti-ISIS operations because they say it is impossible to carry out any operation while you're being threatened by a large army right on the northern border. That has come from Kurdish military sources, so I'll just repeat that because it is significant. The SDF group saying they are stopping their anti-ISIS operations because they say it's impossible to carry out an operation against them whilst you're fighting the Turkish army. That is really significant, for they have been right there at the forefront in the fight against ISIS for years now, and they are now saying they can't do that because of this.
Yeah, so they have been fighting against ISIS for years, and since 2014, the US has been supporting them. So they have been trusting the US administrations that the support will never stop because they have been fighting against ISIS and they have been the troops on the ground for the US. But now President Trump claims that 100% of the ISIS has been ended and they just defeated ISIS. That's why he decided to withdraw its troops from some areas. But we know that they have been keeping prisoners, thousands of prisoners, ISIS prisoners, and also their families, women and children in those areas. But Trump also already said that the responsibility is now on Turkey's shoulders. So we will see what will happen.
Thank you very much for the latest lines there. We're going to take just the shortest of breaks. We're back with much, much more on this developing, breaking story. Let me just take you back to the pictures from the border, because 3 or 4 hours now into this Turkish operation, we know that aircraft have been used. We know that hardware on the ground. So we'll bring you the latest from our teams on the ground. We'll bring you the latest pictures. We'll bring you the latest from Washington. We'll bring you the latest from the United Nations, and more on that line from the Kurdish fighters. They are stopping their operations against ISIS to concentrate on this battle that is now happening in northeastern Syria. Plenty more on our global programme.